Okay, I think we're finally good.
Live and rolling.
Yeah, we're gonna kind of just segue into this, so it's not weird that we're suddenly starting.
Hello.
So yeah, this is gonna be kind of loose and unstructured. Whatever you want to talk about, we have some things written down, but anything you want to talk about?
I don't know whether you want to ask questions first or let me talk a while and see if I covered your questions.
Is it okay if I ask a couple questions?
Sure.
Kind of to get us started. So I guess this is mostly for the family, but if anyone ever watches this that doesn't know you, can you state just kind of preferred name? And we'll all introduce. Yeah, if you could introduce yourself.
My preferred name is Gene Hulbert, of course. Mm-hmm. Not Grandpa, unless you guys want to call me Grandpa.
I think Grandpa is okay for anyone.
Grandpa will work. So.
Okay, and then I'm Michael, and then
I'm Katie.
Okay.
I'm Lara.
Scott.
I don't know.
And then right off screen,
Sarah.
And Sarah.
maybe managing PA duties if we need it, is Sarah. For your grandchildren.
Okay.
So, just, I guess we can start at the very beginning. You were born in 1924, right?
Right.
What do you remember?
Of course, I don't remember being born. And we lived in this. I saw one kind of picture of the place. I think mostly it showed a fenced-in yard that was mostly mud, and it was, I suppose, 10 or 15 years outside of this little burg called Somerton, which has one gas station and one grocery store. So actually, on quite a steep hill. My mother's parents lived sort of in the middle of the town, and I do remember them. They had in the middle of the town. They had a farm where they grew pigs, so they were married in I think in Somerton, because all my mother's family were there. She had 2 brothers and a sister who lived in and about town. Our house was out in the I'd say about 10 or 15 miles away from Somerton, at the end of a gravel lane. I would call it a shack. It certainly did qualify as a log cabin, but I think I was born in something pretty humble.
I was going to say, my mom emailed us asking to hear about the story of your birth. She says that I believe that your dad was out hunting squirrels when you were born.
November 15th, and my dad was indeed out hunting, and my brothers always said he was out hunting skunks. That's why I stunk. That's apocryphal, of course. Mm-hmm. They tell me, and I think it's a passed on memory, that we moved it when I was 4 years old, and she said the real estate agent that would be selling our house teased me about wanting me to stay there because he had a pony, and at 4 years old I wasn't about to stick around. We moved them to Geneva, which is in Asheville County, northeast Ohio, in about the spring of 1929.
Gotcha. So that would have been when you were 5 or so.
I was actually about 4. It was before my birthday.
So this would have still been in the Great Depression then, when you moved?
It was before the Depression. And the nearest I can figure out was that my dad wanted to move. His dad and his brother lived near about 5-10 miles from where we ended up, at 5 miles south of Geneva, on a farm. He had got this job with the Grandford Orchard Company, which is a really good size. My estimate of, he was the manager of an orchard, I swear, was maybe a mile long in one direction, a half a mile deep. Really a big orchard. And his job was to spray the trees in the spring, prune them and all that, hire people to pick apples. The Grandpa Orchard had another orchard about 10 miles away, and combined, they had this refrigerated storage room, which we called the packing house, would hold something like 80,000 bushels. So pretty good size. He started work in 1929 at 15 cents an hour, which was, even then, I think it was slave labor. But in effect, we had an enormous amount of countryside available to us. The field in back of our house was probably a mile deep. It was a hay field, and we grew vegetables in about a 2-acre plot of ground. My memory of it is it was also labor, hoeing corn in the middle of the heat of summer. But that's how we grew up, growing our own food.
How many siblings did you have?
We had 6. 6 of us, 2 boys older than me and 3 girls younger than I. I tried to track after the 2 older boys, 2 and 4 years older than I was, and they would have none of it. Mm-hmm. But I was also small for my age. When I started going to school in 1930, and I was the smallest kid in my class. Literally boy or girl, I was the smallest kid in my class. And of course, the shrimp gets picked on, and I was.
Was it like that through elementary school for you?
All through elementary school. We went to school. The school was maybe 3 miles from our place, on the rim of the Grand River, which is quite a hill. And I have flash memories. One year, I'm not sure which year it was, the bigger kids got me into a fight with another kid about my size, but who was a scrapper. And he beat me up and chased me down over this river hill. I can see that still. As a consequence, I actually built a wall. I had to, almost self-preservation. I was introverted, and I ended up being a loner, which I kept that wall around me. I'll swear till about 1999, and I'll go into that later. I realized soon that I was never going to be able to play ball. I'd never be on a team. Basketball, forget it. And so the only recourse I had was to keep my nose in a book, study.
So, from that early age, did you kind of feel like you were going to go into something academic, or what do you want to be?
Not then. The only thing I had open to me was to study, and there were several times I know I was a teacher's pet because I was quiet and I had my nose in the book. I studied. At
that time, what did you want to be when you grew? Well, what were your dreams?
I think I wanted to stay alive. I will get into that, but I had no real, in the early grades, no real goal in mind. We were devoted to keep alive. We were talking about 33, 36, 37. We
still hunting squirrels for dinner?
I'm sorry?
Still hunting squirrels for dinner?
We never did that. Mm-hmm. we did buy meat, and that's about the only purchase we had. We had a cow for our milk and the vegetables, and my mother would put up about 450 quarts of food to last us through the winter, and things like navy beans we'd write out, and you could have those, the navy bean soup. I guess we could have all the apples we wanted. I got to the point where I never even wanted to see another apple. So I don't have a lot of memories. I have one crazy thing. In the third grade, we had a redheaded teacher, of course, which I fell in love with. I didn't mention that I was a fiery redhead. You know what your mother what Heidi looks like. My hair was at least that red. And Greg's hair was red before he got married. Anyway, so I was a redhead. Oh, I started to talk about the third grade teacher who wrote in Spencerian calligraphy, which is the really fancy writing. Mm-hmm. And my handwriting is almost illegible, and she gave me a P for my handwriting, which is essentially a failing grade. Broke my heart. Anyway, so I have those kind of vignettes of going through the sixth grade. We then switched further out into the country, into a place called Cork for the middle school. And I do remember finally in the ninth grade, I decided I was going to be a scientist. We had another woman that I more or less fell in love with who taught science, and so I was going to be a scientist. And went through the ninth grade, and then in the 10th, 12th grade, we moved into Geneva, which was the city. And all through high school, I was the country kid, ignored. So I never made friends. I had one boyfriend growing up who lived about a mile from us. His name was Blair Close. And as much as she was the only friend I had. In high school, I've seen some of my grades. In high school, I steamed through all the math and science, and almost ignored the English and history classes. So as a consequence, I was getting A's in math and C's in history. My sisters following me suffered because the math teachers kept bragging on me for them and made me sound like a genius, which I wasn't. In the 11th grade, we had our math algebra class, and I did well, and they sent me. I don't know if they still do it, but then they had these competitive exam called state scholarship tests. So in algebra, I went to Kent State then to take these. In algebra, I ended up third at Kent, and somewhere far distant at the state.
This is when you were in high school?
In high school, yeah, in 11th grade. When I was a senior, we had a chemistry teacher who was very, very good. Got me excited and really studying chemistry. So I went to Kent for the chemistry competitive exam, made first, and ended up at third in state, and the state in that high school size category. Well, somehow that convinced me, and then I really was unfortunate, but it convinced me I could be a chemist. I then went to, as a senior, they had a college credit kind of course at an Asheville, a town not far away, to study quantitative analysis, chemistry. I took it, and as a consequence, got a job as I got out of high school in the chemistry lab for what was then the American Fork and Hoe, which made golf shafts, which are True Temper. And they changed their name to True Temper later on.
So back then, with the class you were in, was it as common as it is now for everyone to go to college right out of high school or get a job, or what was
it was not
standard
common.
at that
It was
point?
not common at all. I had no hope of getting into college at that time. But I'd say I worked at this chem lab, and for right after out of high school. That year, my older brother Howard was killed in the war. Bill, my second brother, was flying bombers, and I started thinking that I'd better get in the war.
Yeah, if we
And then-
can kind of double back a little earlier to get into that. When did your oldest brother join the service?
Actually, about 1939, before the war.
Mm-hmm.
I can back up a little bit. We both, or all three of us, the three boys, were nuts about flying, and we all built metal airplanes.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of tagged after my brothers. I've often said, and I think I could explain it, that they built these super model airplanes that looked like they were professionally built with nice shiny wings and so on. The model airplanes I built looked like they'd crash before I flew. That's really how good I was at manual labor. And another reason I decided I was going to be using my brain, and because I couldn't use my hands. So I think in 39, he was killed in 43, as you saw in the paper.
So between those times, my mom asked me to ask you about knitting socks.
Oh, gosh. What happened was, I mean, you're talking about a wartime, not technology, but wartime thought. We were committed to the war. And somewhere along the way, they kept saying, we got to knit this stuff for blankets and what for the troops. So I learned how to knit, and I knitted not socks but squares that were made into blankets. Eventually, I got to the point where I felt I ought to be knitting something else. I actually knitted was after I was going to Iowa State, which is another story. I knitted a sweater with the shape of the bell tower on the front. I mean, got to that point. It still was not a manly job to do, but I really felt we needed to do these sorts of things to help the war.
Yeah, she mentioned your other brother teased you
Well,
about it a little.
Howard somehow found out I was doing this knitting, and he made some kind of disparaging remark about I should not be doing these female jobs. And then my other brother Bill at Howard's funeral actually pulled that letter out and read it at the funeral, which is a little bit irksome. That was the kind of relationship we had.
Jeez.
We were competitive in almost everything. Of course, I was like golf. I was a lot worse than my brother was. Mm-hmm. Anyway, but it's a sort of the sense of what everybody in the country felt like. We had to be doing something. As I said, they were in the service. I actually had an industrial deferment because at that time instead of making golf shafts, the American Fork and Hoe made aircraft aerials using the same technology that it did for golf shafts. And so I could have stayed there for the entire in the Star War, which I didn't want to do. So I bugged my boss a number of times. So he finally got, I wouldn't use the word, he got mad at me. Well, you can use whatever you want to. He got mad at me and said, "Get the hell out of here. I can't listen to you." So I joined. In September 1943, I joined the Navy. And I still thought of myself as a chemist. I went through Great Lakes in fall, September, October 1943. And once I got out of the boots, I volunteered what was called the Chemical Warfare Service. And of course, nobody ever used chemicals in the war, but the Navy had the practice of having a chemical warfare officer on their battleships and their aircraft carriers. Well, how many of those were there? I went through the Army training, the chemical warfare training at Edgewood for 3 weeks. I ended up at a sort of transfer station in Anacostia, which is near downtown Washington, D.C. We're talking November to January, or November, it's about January 1942 and 3. They had one of the best USOs in Washington, D.C. at that time. And Navy people got treated pretty good. So I stationed there. I found out within a day or two that I could get a pass and get out of there before they picked people to do KP, which I then did. So I spent the several weeks leaving there, going to downtown Washington. I think I've seen all the museums that were in existence then, and then in the evening we'd go to USO and dance and come back at 10, 11 o'clock at night, get some sleep, and then get up and do the same thing over again, which is a great duty.
So at that point, kind of going out to dance, did that start to help you become more sociable?
Yeah, I enjoyed the dancing,
Mm-hmm.
which I will get into a bit later. Out of Anacostia, we were sent by some kind of troop train, and literally it was a troop train. We had this car we were in had pot-belly stoves at each end of the car, and stained glass windows on it. I swear, as we got out into the Midwest, you could picture the Indians coming alongside the railroad because it was that old. Ended up at a place called Hawthorne, Nevada, which is on the edge of a big lake, and it's about halfway between Las Vegas and Reno. Probably about as rural as a place you'd never want to see. And it was where the Navy had this enormous ammunition depot. And ostensibly we were sent there because they had some mustard gas projectiles ready to use. And we had a staff, I ended up in a staff of maybe about 90 people, some of whom had come in off the fleet. Really, you would really call them old salts. And once in a while, they'd make up a class of about half a dozen people that go out and check these projectiles, see if they were leaking. If they found a leak, it would be dig a deep hole and throw the thing in. Anyway, the two ways of getting out of there was one being transferred to the fleet. I said earlier that there weren't that many. I mean, aircraft carriers and battleships were the only ones that had CW officers. And I figured I would probably be there for maybe the rest of my life. And while we were there, other than those little few sorties to check the projectiles, literally we were coolies to load these boxcars of naval ammunition. And the heaviest thing we had were aircraft ammunition with both the shell and the projectile in a 3-to-a box on a wood crate, about 180 pounds. We would throw those things up to about 6 feet in the high end of things. Now, I must have been the most in the best shape I've ever been before or since, because we did that. And so the second way to get out of there was to take a competitive exam for what's called the V12 program. That I did, and I was accepted for V12 and sent to Iowa State, but almost halfway home.
And did that have to do with the GI Bill?
No, this was a purely Navy program.
Gotcha.
And so then from the spring, or June 43 to June 46, I went to Iowa State as in the V12 program, in some kind of engineering program. They wouldn't let me be a chemist in the V12 program. So so for those 2 years, I'm sorry, the spring, June of 1944 to 46, I was in V12. The war ended. We had some great celebration down in Des Moines, in the streets.
What was that celebration like?
We've seen movies probably of these going crazy out in the streets. I remember everybody's hugging everybody and kissing everybody. I remember one woman says, "Kiss me on the cheek." I remember it. Anyway, so I was discharged then in June of 46, and came home. And got actually there was a government rule that the company had to rehire you to the same position after you got out. So that summer in 46, I worked again as a chemist. And how to say, actually you may have seen in your great grandma's place their laundry basement laundry. I helped dig that out by hand that summer.
Oh wow!
But I also, I'll back up a minute. Going the 2 years then, from 44 to 46, probably, and my estimate, and I guess somebody else's, was there were about maybe 50% more women at college than there were men. The college would put on what they called mixers, dances each Friday night, and they would hire the big name bands like Tommy Dorsey and I don't remember Glenn Miller, but those kind of things, and we'd have dances. Wearing a Navy uniform during the war, I had no problem getting a date. And so for those 2 years, we'd go to the dance and find somebody, a woman, and I'd date her for a quarter. And then it always turned out that this was not a woman I wanted to marry. But I began to develop a picture of who I really wanted to marry. Came home then that summer, and the only social life there was around our place in the summertime was a roller skating rink about 5 miles away. So I'd go to these roller skating rinks and somehow find a date, and I'd made a date with this woman to go to a Cleveland baseball game. The date was August 14th, 1946. That day, before we were ready to go to Cleveland, that day she cancels out on me. Now, Betty, my sister, had this roommate in her nurse's training. She had been bugging me that summer. Why don't I get a date with her roommate? So she called her up and made the date. And we went to the Cleveland Indian game, and I had picked her up, and we took to the game. I never looked at that game.
So was this a
Because
blind date?
that was your grandma.
Yeah, that's why we
you-
exist. If that girl hadn't stood you up, none of this ever happened.
I back up a little bit. Before I went in service, I've been dating this girl, and I proposed to her. Before I went in service, and she said yes. And so while I was in service, she married my best friend. She had married Blair, who had been my best friend.
That's gotta hurt.
I got a dear John Leto. And actually, but that cut me loose to be doing all this dating while I was at Iowa State. Who knows? God, I swear, God has been watching over me all this while. And
So was this a blind date? You had never seen.
I had never seen her.
Okay, so at the end of the day, do you drive home from Cleveland that night?
Yes,
And then you drop her off.
drop her off.
And what was going through your mind that night?
Oh, my mind was that was it. Literally. Well, we dated.
Did you know like immediately?
Well, I was snowed, if that's the right word, by her beauty and all that. And anyway, we dated then for about 6 weeks before I went back to school. This time I proposed to her as our last date.
So you had only known each other for 6 weeks before you proposed?
Yeah. Well, I'd held these women I'd compared her to, and there was no comparison. No comparison.
So in your mind, you're just like,
Yeah,
let's go.
As far as that was it. Well,
Did you kiss her on the first date?
I honestly can't remember. Probably did. I don't remember. But by the time 6 weeks were up, of course, I had. Although, remember, those days were pretty Puritan, if you will. We kissed, but that's about far as we got. Anyway, so went back to school and there was no dates. I mean, that was it. I knew where I was going. And when I got home for Christmas, I found out she had dating a guy for while I was gone. I probably was a little upset. And somehow or another, I convinced her that I was serious, and then she understood that we were serious. I mean, I talked her into the whole idea. So I went back to Iowa State for my senior year, which was then paid by the GI Bill, because I had been in the Navy, joined the regular Navy, and then got into V12. For those who had joined to the V12 program straight out of civilian life, they were required to sign up for another 4 years of service after they got the degree. And since I'd been in the regular Navy, I was excused from that. I not only got the GI Bill, I got credit for all the years I was at Iowa State as service years, all of which was
That's pretty fortunate.
fortunate, yeah, I would say. So finished up the year Iowa State and got my bachelor's degree, and your grandma and my sister drove using her dad's it was a Mercury coupe, drove out to Iowa to watch me graduate. We then drove back to Columbus, and I remember I drove that 700 miles nonstop, except for bathroom breaks, with one hand. My other hand is wrapped.
Aww.
Literally, we did that. I wrapped around your grandma.
So were her and your sister really close?
I'm sorry?
Grandma and your sister were close friends?
Oh, yeah, they were roommates, still were.
Okay.
Even what happened was they were going to, because neither of them had money, they were being paid by, I guess, the government somehow to get their nurses' degrees. And because of that, they were required not to get married until they got their cap. So then she graduated in spring or June of 1948. We courted well, after I got my bachelor's at Iowa State, I went to Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute on a graduate assistantship because and I did get my degree in chemistry, but the the chair of the chemistry department at Iowa State knew the dean of the graduate school at Brooklyn Poly, put in a good word for me and got me accepted there on a fellowship. So then during the time I was in Iowa State and then went to Brooklyn Poly for that year, be 47, 48, we wrote letters to each other almost every day. And we saved those letters until a long time after we were married. And then I had them in a box. We started reading them, and I said, nobody wants, we're not going to show these things. Literally, we put those letters in our fireplace, burn them up.
That's like your generation's equivalent of deleting your internet history.
Absolutely. That's a great way of looking at it. So then it came back. The second year, I couldn't get a job, the old job I had. I mean, they had done their duty. And so I got rehired at Fork and Hoe this time I was helping to this machine that would somehow form a straight piece of pipe into the stop-down shafts. And for the golf clubs, and what it was is you took this pipe, put in a stand or in this machine, and it moved one step, and you put another in. By the time it stepped all the way around, out comes this step-down golf shaft. I can't imagine a more boring kind of job, but that was my summer.
And where was this job at?
Still American Fork Hoe in Geneva.
Gotcha.
And to occupy my mind, I wrote several poems, which I've since destroyed. Anyway, so that summer, then, of course we were dating. We continued to date, and we were married in August 14, 1948, 2 years to the day after the day we met.
Do you remember how you proposed to her?
Well, yeah, that's the first summer. I said, will you marry me? I simply proposed to her.
Did you have a ring back in those days, or was that not a...
We didn't have a ring. I had no money. I mean, I couldn't afford a ring. But the summer of 1948, with her parents' connivance, we got her downtown Cleveland and sort of herded her into a jewelry store, which where the proprietors were actually friends of her parents, and bought a ring. I think, as I recall, for $100, which is all I could afford.
Wow.
And so, and of course, proposed to her again. I say then we were married in that August 14th.
Did you have a big wedding? Or was
Good
it
size.
family?
Good size. Her parents, her father was German, her mother Bohemian, and so they had a lot of liquor at their place. at that point in time, I was a teetotaler. And so we got out of there as quick as we could headed east to go to Canada in the fishing lodge. The car we had was, this is 1948, the car we had was 1937 Plymouth Coupe. So, and we bought it from one of her cousins for $125.
A car?
The car.
Oh my gosh.
Which came out of our wedding money. We had literally, neither of us had any money to start our marriage except for what we got as wedding gifts, which was about $300. So this car would burn oil, and so we bought a 5-gallon can of oil and to put it in the back in the trunk of this car. And if it showed any kind of the oil going down, we would add a little bit to the crankshaft. We don't know why, but we decided our honeymoon would be at a fishing lodge that her father had gone to several times and knew the proprietors. And the only thing good about it was we could be by ourselves. Anyway, her parents worried themselves because we never called home, of course. They didn't know whether we were out there with this rattle trap somewhere in the middle of the woods in Canada and stuck. But we made it. Then her parents remodeled this little bungalow they had, the second floor, into a 1-bedroom apartment for us.
Was it awkward living above your wife's parents?
I was going to get to that. Because for 4 years, we in fact lived in the same house as her parents. In a way, I suppose it was maybe a way to ease into marriage for her, but for me to have become a part of their family, and literally I was kind of uncomfortable. Her mother was a pretty dominant woman, so we were part of the family. And usually we'd have Sunday dinner with them. Otherwise, I was off to school or working, and she was working too. So we'd get out of the house in the daytime, but our evenings we were part of the family. I say for me, it was uncomfortable. That's a nice way of putting it. Anyway, after I got my master's, incidentally, I wanted to be, by then, I forgot the chemistry, I wanted to be an applied mathematician. And it turns out that the case professors were, with one exception, all very far out mathematicians. But I took the classes anyway. And when I got my degree, your grandma still wanted to stay in Cleveland because all of her family was there. And so I hunted for a job and found the only one I could take was to be an actuary with a pension consultant. And so for 2 years I struggled to be an actuary, using what math background I had that was applicable. And after 2 years I got fired.
For what?
I never asked, but I got fired. I didn't, and I really didn't like the job anyway, but that's an excuse. I literally tried my best to do the work we had.
I was gonna ask, because I know the story that's kind of coming up, but at the time, despite not really liking the job, how did you take being fired at first?
ashamed. In fact, we hardly ever talked about my being fired. I mean, it's a I would say, first of all, it's a shock. I had no idea I was going to be fired. I really had tried to do my best. And so it's a blow to your ego.
Mm-hmm. But what came about because of that firing?
The interesting thing, and I swear that this whole sequence, I will come back to it later, I swear that God was doing this to me, to us. Because I had heard about Batelle, and I had a summer job at the American Society of Heating Ventilation Engineers Research Lab in Cleveland on doing a little project which turned out to be successful to calculate how, if we had back then the radiant heating was in vogue, and they wanted to know how much heat went from the heating pipes through the floor to heat the house, or through to the ground, and they wanted to know what the percentage was depending on the relative depth of the barrier. I stumbled across a little analysis program using series solutions, and it turned out it was a very neat solution to the project. But at the process and working there, I had met someone who had worked at Batelle and talked about it. So when I got fired, I drove from Cleveland to Columbus. I was given 2 weeks notice. Drove to Cleveland to Columbus, and I walked in the front door. I made out an application. I can't remember, but I think that back then they had IQ tests, which is illegal now. But I got fired. I got hired at Batelle that day. For whatever reason, I don't know. But so then September 1952, we moved to Columbus. I had found an apartment that was being built, and in fact, by the time we moved in, they hadn't even given us a toilet seat, which is, with our 1-year-old child, was a little bit disconcerting to Beanie, to your grandma. I started work there, and your grandma was an RN, had been, back up during the years after after we were married. She worked at what was called then an insane asylum, which was an insane asylum. One flew over the cuckoo's nest kind of thing. I mean, it was nasty. But she worked there for 4 years. Moved to Columbus, and she wanted to get a job at what was called then the White Cross, the predecessor to what's now the Riverside. And they required her to take a full X-ray chest plate. They found a spot on her lung, and she went through all sorts of tests, bronchoscopy and whatever. And they found that she had cancer of the thymus gland. There was nothing to do but get it cut out. But she had known of the surgeon, I think a Dr. K, that was practicing then in Cleveland, who actually later on became well known as worldwide as chest surgeon. So she went back to Cleveland, got the operation, and they took out about a fist-sized hunk of her chest, scraped her pericardium, took out one lobe of her lung, and sewed her back up. And then specified that she get radiation treatment with what was then the only source was radium, and then the rays from the radium were hard, and so she was burnt front and back, ended up with a scab, essentially scars, a scar and a scab on her front and back, and eventually destroyed her sternum to the point where I couldn't touch it. It would hurt just to touch her. So by the fall of 1954, she was flat on her back. And to get this radiation treatment, she would take a train to Cleveland with Greg, who was a year and a half old.
Uncle Doug or Uncle Greg?
I'm sorry, Uncle Doug. And she said that kid would run up and down the hall, up and down the rail car, picking up cigarette butts. That's what she remembered. Anyway, so
the way my mom asked me to bring up that story, she said that if you hadn't lost that job, they would have never found that cancer.
Well, I was getting to that.
Sorry.
Absolutely so. If I had stayed on that job another 6 months, she'd have been dead. Literally. I mean, just flat out. The doctors told us that fall that she had about 6 months to live. And we prayed, everybody prayed, trying to figure out what we would do. I tell you, working at the Batelle and the demands they had, there was no way I could raise a child by myself. And in fact, I would guess probably if that happened, I'd have had to give her off to the beach parents. There was no way. Or quit the job, and then I don't know what to do. So I say we prayed. In the January 1955, they found one node in her shoulder, which turned out to have that same cancer. So it had metastasized that far. They took that out, never found any more cancer. We didn't talk much about my getting fired, but I now truly understand that it was God that was watching over us. And it said if I had not been fired, she wouldn't have lived. So God brought us together in a really weird way, and got me fired and found the cancer. It was asymptomatic. She didn't see anything like that. Never felt it. So.
All right, I want to circle back to Grandma in a bit because I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about her. What was Batelle known for at that time?
I'm sorry?
What was the company Batelle kind of known for? Like, how did you know them for when you got hired there?
Well, back then they were doing a lot of, they always did contract research. At that time, they were had a stronger in metallurgy because Gordon Batelle was a metallurgist. The first job I worked on was as a statistician, and I had taken one statistics course. And that might have been the reason I got hired. I don't know. I didn't question it.
What are some of your favorite projects you worked on throughout your career? Because I've got a laundry list, but I want to hear which ones of these stand out to you.
I was going to, when I started out, I was going to say I have about 3 streams of that I want to talk about. One of them being, I'll talk about some of the jobs I had. But let's finish now. Let me go on and talk about our marriage. And
Yeah, go for it.
the doctors told us that we shouldn't have any more children
Because of the radiation?
because of her condition. The nearest I can figure out or find out this cancer of the thymus gland, and the thymus gland is operative only as you're grown up. It's as you're going from a child to an adult. It drives something, and then it's supposed to go quiescent. Hers didn't, but then back then they said this cancer is rare and essentially totally fatal. In fact, in a weird way, I hired a fellow whose wife was an oncologist, and she simply flatly said that nobody lived with cancer of the thymus gland. We didn't say anything. We knew one person that had. Anyway, so over the next period of few years, she simply recovered, and I kept on working. 5 years later, we had Greg. As far as I know, it was God's gift. 5 more years we had Heidi. And I think they were our miracle children. Excuse me. And you are miracle grandchildren. She worked on and off before and after each of your parents, and eventually ended up in what was called a cancer registry, where she would take these strange doctors' records and try to make them into computer language. And we continued being married. Maybe this time to say that I started out, and for most of my life I was a loner, even being married, working at Batelle. Most of the stuff I really did was as a loner. In 1998, we started I'd gone through an Emmaus weekend, which was a Christian weekend of sorts, sponsored by the Methodist Church. And as a result of that, I was asked to join a prayer group. I was headed by John Wagner, who was a retired minister. And we started in Bible studies, again sponsored by the Methodist Church, called Disciple. And it essentially was a 34-week program. First Bible study, or Disciple 1, was to go through the entire Bible through selected chapters. And then from then on, 2, 3, and 4, they would take different sections, one part. I'd spend half the time on the Old Testament, half the time on the New. And first time either of us, she or I, had ever read the Bible. As a combination of that, and with our prayer group with John, that often ended up to be John and I. And we gradually became best friends. At least he was the best friend I'd ever had. And between literally studying the Bible and all the conversations that John and I had, I changed from a loner to what I am now. I look for people to help.
That's amazing.
And so that was 1998. I suppose I never was reborn. That's something I never was. But over a period of, say, 2 or 3 years, 98 to 2001 maybe, I had changed.
I think maybe a little after that period, I had a conversation with you when I was like in elementary school. And I want to ask you the same question now that I did then, which what got me thinking was learning in science class, how the universe was made and comparing that to the story of Genesis and how things were done in days. And now it's a little less about that and a little less literal, but you're one of, if not the smartest person I've ever met, but you're also deeply religious. In your mind, how do those two parts of yourself go together?
I have, since 98, read every book I could ever find and on the universe, Big Bang, evolution, and whatnot. And I would guess I've probably read more than 36 books. Some by atheists, mostly by those who believe in God. And I can say, I can't point to a chapter of any one of these books, but after having read them and to the point where I could understand what they were saying, I believe one, God created the universe. He has been involved in its development ever since, in detail. He masterminded the creation of this planet because in order to have the elements we need to live, that is being carbon and others, it required, the only way you can make these elements is through a supernova explosion. Star formation will go through from hydrogen, helium, and so on until they get to iron. They can't within a star. They can't make anything more than iron. By that time, they have used up all their sources of nuclear energy, and it will indeed explode and end up as supernova. In the process of that intense and high temperature explosion, they can create the rest of the elements. So, in order for us and for the Earth to have anything like as carbon, just carbon, we've had to have a supernova explosion somewhere in this vicinity of the Milky Way. As near as the scientists can ascertain, the Earth was formed out of this rotating disk at the same time that planets were formed, and about 4 or 5 billion years ago. It went through, of course, a lot of paroxysm, one of which was that the large satellite had rammed into the Earth and they injected the material that's now the moon. The really weird things is, one, we are in an arm of the Milky Way that's quiet. We don't have any, the nearest star is 4 4 light years away. If we were in a place where there's a lot more stars, we would have radiation that would kill everything off. So here we are in this arm, nice and quiet. The sun is in a stable part of its existence to the point where, and we are at the right place, distance from the sun, that if we're any closer, the water would all evaporate. If we're any further within percent, the water would be ice. So we're at this point that we have water. Most of the water was deposited on the Earth by meteors over a period of its early existence. Anyway, excuse me, if we trace the evolution of human beings through this Earth, we've gone through all sorts of weird kind of combinations. If people have, not me, but people have figured out if the Earth were to form by accident, the chances of it are 10 to the minus 50th or so, be infinitesimal. If you take that probability and multiply by the total number of stars in the universe, it'd still come out to be maybe 10 to the minus 20, which means it couldn't happen. It had to be directed. So I believe God made this Earth.
And more than that, you were really influential on me in saying that it's not God or science. You think they're both one and the same.
Oh, yes. Now, as I said, I've now gone through the Bible 3 or 4 times, at least 3 times, maybe 5. And also have read that what the evolutionists or the scientists or the cosmologists say about what's said in the Bible. And what is supposedly science in the Bible, it's called ancient science. Mm-hmm. Now, if you think about what people were back then in Jesus' time, well, he recruited fishermen. Mm-hmm. I mean, these fishermen, they knew how to fish. They looked at the heavens and saw the stars. If God had told them that the stars were 17.5 or 7 billion years out there in space, how would they understand? And so God has essentially told them what they could understand at that point in time. It's taken us.
Yeah. And you're saying there's a human history there too.
I'm sorry?
There's a human history too to consider.
Yes. So it has taken us, and just in the last 100 years or so, to get to a point where we begin to understand a little bit how infinite the universe really is, or how old it is.
Okay.
So now,
if I can segue.
Sure.
And then I have a bunch of questions we'll get to at the end. I just want to make sure we're getting all the important stuff. So, speaking of the infinite universe, you worked on a lot of projects involved with space travel. Could you talk about that kind of stuff you were doing at Batelle?
Can I wait a while? Because I want to.
Yeah. Sorry, go for it.
Yeah, I can wait a while. I'd like to wait a while. Anyway, so I said, starting about 1998, I had this change of heart, or more, whatever you want to call it. And by the time your mother was, well, let me say this, she began having this, well, remember she had cancer, stage 4 colon cancer in 1983, at which time there wasn't anything called chemotherapy. And essentially she had to have it taken out, which she did, and she lived 21 more years. By the time 2004, the doctor said that she had the heart murmur and figured out it was calcified aortic valve. He said he recommended that she do minimally invasive surgery to get the valve replaced. I went on the internet and looked up, found that the Frenchman had done 5 replacements of the aortic valves using a catheter coming in through the leg, and I asked the surgeon, incidentally, because I had changed, I went with her to all the surgeons, which I had never done before. She was on her own. How to think about that? Anyway, he said that operation was purely experimental. He wouldn't recommend doing it with her. So she got her operation, which went fine. She got out of the ICU, and you guys remember that. She got into an ordinary hospital, and 2 days later she had what they called essentially hospital-based drug-resistant pneumonia. And they treated her with these high-powered antibiotics, whose names I can't remember. As a consequence, they cleaned out her gut out of all the good bacteria she had, we all have. And she ended up with the C. diff, which we have the C. diff bacteria, which is almost always controlled by the good bacteria. And she fought that. They got that sort of under control, but she could never get off of the breathing tube. They never really got that pneumonia controlled. She ended up with, as you know, the catheter, or the, what do you call it, the tracheotomy. And eventually the C. diff came back and they told her now why I'm talking about that, not only that it's our history, but by that time I had changed enough that I could endure her passing. If that had happened in, say, 1995, I don't know what I'd have done. Got my whole being's changed. Since then, I have tried to undo. When I know of a friend who's lost a spouse, I will do my best and have to help them in their loss. Part of why I'm here. And I've broadened out things like the Kairos prison weekend and all the mission trips that are going on. So here I am.
Here you are.
I am dedicated with what few years I have left to serving God in whatever way He calls me to do. So, say here I am. Now, if we go back to me too. Yeah, let's. If you want to talk about some of the jobs I have how many page?
I'm just gonna glance over it. I want to make sure we get certain categories checked off, and then we'll see how much time we have at the end.
All right.
This is a good problem to have, by the way. You're doing incredible. So, what were computers like when you first started working with them?
There weren't any. That's what they were like. When I got to Batelle, we didn't have any. We had a card punch where you could take two numbers and multiply them together and punch it under the hole in that same card. There's a little bit of multiplication. And that was it. About 2 or 3 years after I joined Batelle, we had a thing that IBM had cobbled together. It would have 4 big boxes. One big box was arithmetic unit. One was essentially a card reader and printer. And there was one box that had 20 storage registers, 20 words of storage. And what was the 4th box? I don't remember what the 4th was. Anyway, it could read 100 cards a minute, and that was its processing speed. So you could program it to do some calculation, and it'd still read a card and punch another one in at 100 words a minute. About 1955, and this is typical, I would say, of the kinds of jobs I got into. The chemistry department had a contract with Westinghouse to do an analysis of their meltdown of the shipping port reactor, which is a Westinghouse reactor.
I was going to ask about, was that the 3 Mile Island meltdown?
No, before 3 Mile Island.
Gotcha.
This is 1955. Anyway, they had messed around with this contract, that is the chemistry department, messed around with this contract to the point where there's like 6 weeks left to go in the contract. And they came to me, I had, on my master's thesis, was actually a study of the heat equation, that is heat transfer. And somehow or another they found that out and came to me and said, could I please write a program to calculate how long this reactor would take to melt down. We had no machine. I mean, our CPC was really idiotic that we could ever do anything. I found out that Nationwide Insurance downtown had a machine called the 650, which had a drum of storage, 2,000 words, and it was 12,000 RPMs, that is rotating 12,000 rotations a minute.
How big was that machine?
Oh,
with 2,000 word storage capacity.
It would have been about, well, the console was so high, but of course it had a lot of tape storage. You would be feeling about this room. Anyway, and what I was going to do was do a finite difference calculation. It would have what amounts to the heat generation profile of a reactor tube. And knowing how much heat was being generated along this tube, I could do a finite difference calculation to see, take the heat out of the tube into the water around it, and then how long, using the heat capacity of water, how long it would take to boil the water, and all sorts of things. I mean, I won't go into this.
How did you go from projects like that to doing stuff for, like, the space shuttles?
Well, let me finish this one first.
Gotcha.
Back then, there was no programming language. I mean, I did it in machine language, which was like, I had to do each of 2,000 words on the drum. I gave them a number count, and then I'd take what I needed out of position 512, do the multiplication out of something coming out of 515 and whatever. And I made a map of these storage registers, and using the machine language to do all this calculation. For 6 weeks, I was writing this program, and I would take it down to Nationwide midnight and run their machine until 8 o'clock in the morning. I would come back to Batelle and I would try to figure out what bugs I had and correct them, and I'd go back. I did this for 6 weeks. I literally, it was 20-hour days.
Wow.
By the end of that 6 weeks, I was shot. I mean, I'm totally shot. And they decided that, well, I would take your grandma and I went to Lakeside and I rented a cottage, and we just plain sacked out for the week. I guess we gave, that was 55, we gave Greg or Doug to her parents to take care of while we were there. And literally we just, the end of 6 weeks, I came back and started working again. Finally finished that program with several contract extensions in 13 months. And it found out that we could let the shipping port sit there and stew for several hours and start trickling water back over the thing and cool it down so it wouldn't melt. They used that same program in 2 different submarine reactors. And I do believe it was the first time that had ever been done.
That's the one programmed to solve
That program.
nuclear equations.
Some year later, I went to a math conference, and somebody had written a program in two dimensions that is taking the diameter in account, which I'm not sure was even necessary. Anyway, he wrote a paper on this 2-dimensional project. Well, we finished the report for Westinghouse and we gave it to them, and they put their name on it and said, "Thank you very much." I could have written a paper on that, but they wouldn't let me. And that's kind of typical of what some of the things we did. The second, but I think that was a pioneering project. I was also called in then about 1960 to, again from another department, to help them solve problem of this was a nuclear reactor that they were trying to build to power a rocket. And they wanted to essentially wanted to develop a thermal stress analysis of the stresses in this rocket. And they had, this other group had written the program, and it got me there to help them find their best way of solving the problems. It's essentially, you develop a matrix, and then you do try to solve this matrix. And it just gets to be really mathematical, you know. And we looked for and found all sorts of fairly advanced mathematical methods of solving these matrix equations. We ended up, we'd run these doggone things. There was a different kind of approximation methods.
You were doing that all using punch cards to solve these kind of things?
It was punch cards. Actually,
wow.
Literally, our program is a full drawer long.
Wow.
Make sure you don't drop the drawer.
And as a matter of fact, these matrices were so big we couldn't run it on the computer we had. We had to go down to Oak Ridge or Los Alamos, actually, and run this program. Finally, we had every advanced matrix solving process we found. We could reprogram it in there and run. If I decided the best we can do was maybe within 50% of the stresses that they had. And the reason is we finally decided or discovered or figured out what we were trying to solve was the thing where they had a big central hole that had the nuclear material in it, and around this thing in a hexagonal form with 6 holes that held the coolant, or the coolant passed through. So this is actually six-fold symmetry, so we can actually analyze a 30-degree wedge of this thing. It was, but the thing was, we could solve the thermal problem was easy because it's a second-order equation. Forgive me for using mathematics.
Yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about mathematically.
Stress is our fourth-order equation, harder to solve. What we found is that we started at the center of this wedge with the temperatures and heat input, and as you went out to the end, you ended up with an ill-conditioned matrix. Simply, things could go way crazy on you as you marched out along this wedge, and. But we ended up with this figure about 50%. Well, we went to Oak Ridge for a number of times to run these programs. At that time, that's 1960. Oak Ridge had a whole host, a group of probably the world's best mathematicians, and they decided. They were a little bit offended that here we are coming in and using their machine to solve a problem they could probably run rings around us with. They actually programmed another way of problem solving, which is pretty straightforward as this a routine program. But problem was it takes more storage than we could even countenance. What they did was they started, programming it there so that they would use computer tapes, the tapes as external storage to use all this in an enormous amount of storage. And if they ran this program, I mean, they were having 20 tapes spinning at the same time, back and forth, ping-ponging their data back and forth, just in there to keep that amount of storage. Now, of course, with a terabyte storage, that's ridiculous. I mean, back then we had machines with 32K of storage.
Yeah, now you get like 10 gigabytes free when you sign up for an email.
Yeah. I've got a half a terabyte thing. External thing that looks like a phone book for crying out.
Can you give us like the less mathematical, because I don't understand that, can you give us the layman's terms of your like most proud projects?
Well, it turns out that I was in almost the same time, the 61 or 62, I was working on my thesis program, which used a different way of solving this particular problem that happened to be plates with holes in them. You saw me, and by using that, and that, strangely enough, was essentially the same kind of problem or solution method I was using in 1950 when I did that thing on the radiation, or what do you call it, radiated cool thing. Same thing. By using this series program, I could get what amounted to a number of digits of accuracy. After I did my thesis, which is just on the stress problem, I realized I could actually convert that or write a thermal analysis problem, and put them together and do a thermal stress analysis. And I did. And so I let the Los Angeles people know we'd finished that contract. I let them know that I had this process and I could really indeed solve that problem. And so they paid me to bring my thesis program, or the thermal stress program, out, and they got the Oak Ridge boys who had their fancy solution, our own program, and my thesis program. And one night we were in all 3 programs on this problem, which was my solution was correct. I mean, accurate to more 4 or 5 digits or whatever we wanted to say. Their program was pretty good within the percent. I mean, the Oak Ridge guys, and we were like 50%. And I said, this may have been the first time that problem had ever been solved. And we should write a paper, which we never did.
Thermal stresses in the core of like nuclear rockets, right?
Anyway, they actually built this rocket. Never flew it because nobody's going to stand for having this big hunk of a reactor material floating around. Although they did fire it 2 or 3 times out in the desert and let it go.
Tell us about your work on the Cassini spacecraft.
Oh, that's sometime later. I mean, so that was about 63. I got my degree, and about 64 and 65, we had this reaction that get follow up with Los Alamos. Later, about 69, we had a contract with Edwards Air Force Base to help them. They were going to build a fluorine rocket, and the fluorine being terribly corrosive, they wanted to figure out what kind of life they could have with the bellows. And rockets have bellows all over the place. And bellows, there are 2 kinds of bellows. One being what's called the form bellows, which is you start out with a straight piece of tube and with pressure, hydraulic pressure, form it into a corrugated wall. So it has a lot more flexibility than an ordinary straight piece of tubing. There's what's called the welded bellows, in which you start out with more or less corrugated flat sheets, and you alternately weld the outside edge and the inside edge of these 2, so you end up have these plates they'll displace, and they could be a lot more flexible. But these 2 edges are welded together where all the hinge action comes, and so that you're exercising these welded pieces, and so the fatigue life is not very big. We found out, I found a program that enabled us to analyze both shapes, and we found out that if instead of having the edges flat, you could actually tilt them in a way that you actually put no stress on the welds at all. So these welds, and we made some, and then the bells would deflect, and you'd see these 2 edges, they just kind of ride up and down with no stress.
And that went into a rocket that then went on to orbit Jupiter, right?
No, that's later. Anyway, so we finally, and that was the problem was they were terribly hard to make. Those, because you had a strange looking fittings.
Were there
But later on, I found out that some company was making these bellows with the inside edge tilted, the outside edge flat. So you get at least half the benefit of these tilted edges. I think that was one of the most successful projects we ever did, because we literally found a solution where that son of a gun, those things work.
Is that something that's still used today?
I don't know.
Okay.
Most of the things I've worked on, we like, how do you cast them out into the world and whatever happens.
When you were doing stuff for rockets, did that did you feel like a connection to being a kid and kind of being obsessed with flying with your brothers?
I don't know.
It seems like it was more math based than
And
anything.
yeah, I I've called myself a lot of different names. Early in my work at Batelle, I was a nuclear scientist because I designed the shipping port thing. Then I did it with a rocket. I think altogether I think most of my work is what I would call mathematical. It would be applied mathematical analysis, which is what I really wanted to do. So, one more before I get to the Cassini.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, well, I'll skip a couple.
We'll see after this. You're good. You can keep going.
Okay, I'll skip a couple, but the one that I thought was kind of cute. Batelle got a lot of money out of helping the Xerox be developed, and at that point, in about late 1960s, they had this money to do fundamentalist research in-house, and I got a project together with their Northwest labs to look at the design of an anchor for implants. And the Northwest, I had this, what they called the titanium, porous titanium metal, so it had holes in it. And they wanted to help in designing this thing. The idea being if we put an anchor in and you force it out against the bone with these porous metal, the bone naturally would simply grow into the thing and anchor the thing. I figured out that there's a thing called centerless grinder where you have a tapered screw and 3 flanges around it that as you rode up on the screw toward the thicker end, it would force the flanges out. And I figured out if we made something like that, you could actually turn the thing as you put it in the joint, your bone, that's what you've drilled out of the bone, and then force it against the bone. And we actually designed them and built, and they ended up putting it in Pygmy Goat, which an hour after they put this implant in was out scampering around. It was like they didn't even know we had it.
Had that been done before?
No.
That's amazing.
We got a patent. So we got the patent, and of course it had 15 names on it, all the people working. And
you're listed as a name?
I'm on one of them. Some years later, I heard that some company, back then, I'm talking 1970, there weren't that many knees put in. There were some shoulder joints, but those weren't quite as suitable. I heard that some company actually bought that patent. I got a leather thing of a notebook, leather thing, and a dinner out of that. That was my payback from Batelle. But I think that was a neat little project.
I'm also supposed to ask about your work on the Pringles can.
Oh yeah, a little bit later. That was about 1970. About 77, 78. Pringles came to Batelle with this problem. And again, I don't know how it ended up in my lab. The problem was the Pringles are made with, they started with paste, just a paste. And they roll it through a big heated drum, which is about 4 feet diameter, maybe 4 feet wide or whatever. And the problem was the center of this drum was heated, and as it got out to the edge was cooler, so that the center would expand to the point, and roll this out thing between two of these rolls. The center then would be larger, the radius is larger than it was at the outside. So you could get a nice uniform sheet of this stuff, at the center until about you get out the outside, and it would be thicker. So they estimated they'd lose about 10% of their paste because it's too thick on the outside. So they asked, I don't know how they came to us, but we figured out that just simply thermal expansion, the center was radius was more than the outside, and they gave me the temperature profile across the drum. And I took the temperature profile and calculated what the radius was, the thermal expansion across the diamond and the outside edge, and suggested that, well, okay, if you actually drill or grind the center of the disc and give it a profile so that when it's cold, the center radius was smaller than the outside. When they got the thermal expansion, it'd be flat across. And it worked.
And thanks to that, we have delicious Pringles in every gas station.
With about, I suppose, a month's work or less, I think I saved them probably about 10% of production costs. It was cute.
So is that for the actual chip or the can?
The chip.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Gotcha.
For the chip. And what they do is after they roll this sheet out, they just cut the Pringles out of it, and then bake them. So yeah, it was a cute little project. Now
We're good.
I'll skip a couple of projects.
Okay.
If you want my whole history, I've got it printed out.
I'm gonna include that as like a supplementary link with this gets published. I think we're gonna try and have as much as possible.
How much do you want to give him an idea of how much time we have?
Yeah. I'm gonna say, let's try and wrap it up in this next half hour or so.
Oh, we can do that.
Okay.
And we have some questions for you too.
Yeah,
All right.
You're still perfect.
As I said, it was often, and it might even have been always, or almost always, somebody else at Batelle had got into a project and came to me for help after they got into trouble. And that was okay. Actually, as being a mathematician, you don't really go out and beat the bushes to do use for projects that'll be mathematical that you can do. So these were physicists who had got this project to look at the heat source for this deep space programs. The thing was, as you get out far enough, you don't have enough heat or light energy from the sun to run your spacecraft. So they wanted to use plutonium pellets which give off radioactive heat, and then use the thermoelectric generators to convert that into electricity to run the spacecraft. And they needed to know had to go through this safety rules that if the spacecraft were to blow up and these pellets would come down through heating, and so they had thermal stresses in the pellets. If they come down and hit like concrete road, they were not to break open, because you scattered plutonium around. That's not nice. I mean, that's nasty stuff. So they wanted me to develop. They had done a thermal analysis of their own. They wanted me to develop a thermal stress analysis program using the thermal data to calculate what the thermal stresses were as in this pellet coming down. Now, they had designed this outside protection shell at the time was going to be what's called poco graphite, which all it means is that it's graphite that they have been refined, but it's still the graphite that's in your lead pencil. Brittle as the devil. So along the way, I did write a thermal stress program and found out that I wrote it and we didn't find an element theory, and so that the points that you calculate to in the thermal stress program are different than the points were in the finite difference program. I had a heck of a time. Finally, I decided, this is 1989, or 88, somewhere in there, that I'd heard that they were making the graphite shafts using graphite filaments, and they were starting to look at the idea of somehow weaving this graphite fiber into three-dimensional way, so you can have graphite fiber going through the thickness as well as around. You could actually do it, and I decided that surely 3D wave graphite would be more fracture resistant than the stuff that they were using. And so they decided to try it, and they literally built some of these things with plutonium pellets surrounded by these 3D weave graphite shells. And they took these suckers to Los Alamos, where they had a setup that you could fire through a membrane into a sealed container, and you wanted it sealed because you'd be scattering plutonium around. And they literally fired some of these against the wall into this thing, and they didn't break open. So, problem solved. Don't worry about thermal stress. You make these things out of 3D. You don't have any way of calculating what the stresses, fracture stresses were.
So then those are what powered the spacecraft once it got far enough away from the sun?
Yeah. We went through our final report, gave it to whoever it was back then, the safety office, and they said, thank you very much, and goodbye. It wasn't 4 or 5 years later that I was at a conference in Chicago. I met the guy who had been in charge of the testing program at Los Alamos. So I said, whatever happened to that thing we did? He says it's Cassini up there going around Saturn. First I knew that we had made something, or we had designed something that worked, and that they crashed Cassini into Saturn like in March this year. The last thing I ever worked on at Batelle that was still working, that was Cassini. So everything I've ever worked on, that includes the shuttle,
One more.
It's gone and done. I'll talk about. The shuttle's next.
Yeah, you know where we're going.
Was that the tiles?
That's the tile.
Okay.
And that was when Mom was a freshman in college.
Okay,
so
well
that's a little later on.
I thought that was the Cassini. That's not the Cassini.
No, that's not the Cassini.
Okay.
You still have a tile?
Yeah, I think somewhere in my room there.
That's okay.
We're good. We're good. I'm just being paranoid about this battery. I want to make sure we get everything. I have another one charged.
1979, I happened to be between projects. And NASA, one of the guys at NASA, who was like assistant director under Chris Kraft, came to Batelle and he says, I've got $500,000. You guys, not will you, but you will, set up a team, come to Los Angeles, and do a scientific review of all the data that they have on these tiles. Thermal stresses, acoustic stresses, whatever else. And not that you would, or not that you would agree to, please do it. Doggone, you are going to do this. I mean, it was as much of a demand performance as anything I've ever heard of. So I somehow, for some stupid reason, I agreed to be a team leader for this group. And we assembled this, about a dozen guys who were stress analysts. And the problem was we didn't have any aerodynamicists anywhere at Batelle. I did get one of the stress analysts from our Northwest labs. And so we had two guys from NASA Langley as the aerodynamicists. And so we moved out to Los Angeles, and we found probably our travel department, somebody found us a place, an apartment building that had enough apartments that we could house our people. I had lots of interesting conditions on that. We were allowed to come home every other week or have our family come out there every other week, paid for by the project. We each had cars, rented cars, and so on. One of the conditions was that we had to either go to Houston to do a project report, or that somebody from Houston would come out to our place every 2 weeks. Nobody but this one guy who's one of the assistant directors at Houston really wanted to do this project. I mean, they hated us for it because these tiles had been designed by the thermal guys down at Houston. I mean, this was their baby, and here we were going to come down, come in and
tell them they weren't good.
tell you got to do something else. So one guy, not a monitor, but another one of the directors from Houston came to me about a week or so after we were there, and he says, "How in the world do you think you're going to get out of this project? Why did you do this?" And I said, "We had no choice. They told us." And I said, "We're going to play it straight down the middle. We'll look at what you have. We'll find out what we did, and we will report what we found." I mean, just plain flat out. So, first day we were there, our whole team, we went into all the project engineers, and they gave us a history of their analysis, and they were using all these mnemonics. I mean, SIP and whatever else. And it was a foreign language, right? So I went back to the office and I got what documentation I could find, and I wrote a whole page list of the acronyms that they were using so we know what the language was. And that first week we were there, Rockwell people just kind of hemmed and hawed and wouldn't give us a thing. So I reported back to Houston that these guys really weren't very cooperative. And so one of their directors came out and got their project engineer and they did that, and he says, you give them everything they want or you don't have another project. I mean, he says, you're out of a business in this. So everything, they dumped everything on us. Well, what happened was that we went through all of their analysis, we studied what they did, and everything they did was right. I mean, their acoustic stresses were fine. I mean, their analysis had been just on the button. Their thermal stresses were great, and all that. The thing was, and the crazy thing was that you start out with, there's 31,000 of these tiles. They're not going to be exactly the same. There could be some be stronger and some weaker. All right, so if you do a statistical analysis of the fracture of these things, do a simple statistical analysis of given a range of stress or range of strength of a tile. We showed that if you had one tile come off the wrong place, you get a zipper effect, and others just keep coming out. we finally, and then you're doing this statistical analysis, we showed them that you really have to make every one of the tiles stronger in order to get the lowest one, be sure that it's going to be solid. And that was our report. Had nothing to do with this, with how they built it, had nothing to do with how they announced it. Nobody had thought of the statistical probability of failure. And it was crazy. All the experts we had in all these different fields, we didn't. I mean, we showed with them that what they had done was right. And this one guy came along. I don't know how he thought of this. I didn't. He thought of doing the statistics of the thing. Was the one that showed what they hadn't done, and that is to do this kind of thing. And we convinced them that they had really to strengthen every last one of the tiles. They already had developed a method to do that, and they did. So that Challenger, when it came back, made it back. Actually, when it was up, when they opened the cargo doors, they could, with the video, they could look out back to see the tail. Actually, there were several tiles off of the tail had come off. But you couldn't look underneath where the heating really, the critical part was. Couldn't look. We often wondered, did they really turn that thing over and look at it from a space? Mm-hmm. We don't know. Anyway, it got back, and our contract monitor called my boss, a department manager, and says, "You saved the tile. You saved the shuttle." Then we got a letter about several months after we were done, and he says, "You saved us about 6 months of work." He wouldn't tell us we saved the shuttle on paper, but anyway, so we made it through all that pressure, and it was the most stressful, pressure-wise project I ever was ever on.
How long was the project?
And turn?
How long did you spend?
About 6 months.
Oh, wow.
We were there 2.5 months doing that.
My mom said that when you were in California, she was worried you and Grandma were going to get a divorce just because of how much time you were spending apart.
Well, she came out. I came home once or twice. And she came out once with Heidi to visit us. But yeah, that was out of that time. I guess we saw each other twice. And I said it was pressure filled. I mean, they were on my back that whole time, and so we came out of it smelling like a rose. One of the vice presidents of Batelle treated us all to a dinner. He actually came down to listen to our final presentation to this huge bunch of the people there using them, 100 or so. And so he bought us dinner to celebrate our success. Yeah, it was a tough project. And we made it. Tough. I could talk about a couple of disasters, but I won't.
Okay, just a sec.
Yeah, ours too.
Okay.
I've talked a lot about a number of the projects I was on. I've said just a couple of mentions about how I got educated. My folks, even after the country started recovering, never did have money. There was no way that they could have paid for me to go to college, but I wanted to. And I mentioned how I got into Iowa State through the V12 program. Literally, the government paid for my bachelor's degree partly through the V12 program and the GI program. In the Navy, as I recall, I got $20 a month and board, and of course they paid for the scholarship, and I was went to Brook and Poly with GI Bill, which was $100 a month, and a graduate fellowship, which I think is also $100 a month, and then at Case, the same thing. So the government paid for both my master's and my doctor's through the Navy program for the GI Bill. There was no way that I could have gone through college without that support. So I went to Batelle with a master's degree, and fortunately got into a fair number of programs. About 1958, 59, I took a look at I really did want to be an applied mathematician. So I took a look at the math department at Ohio State, took one course over there, which they called applied math. It turned out that was the only applied math course that department had, and they were fancy theoretical mathematicians. Something called algebraists, which is pretty far out. I found then that there was another department at Ohio State that was called engineering mechanics. And I looked at their curricula and decided that was probably as close as I could get to applied mathematics. Batelle paid then for so I started in about 1959 with that department. And so I did the coursework through about 1962, studying half time while still working at Batelle full time. In order to satisfy the residency requirement for a degree, that department and I and Batelle decided that I would satisfy my residency by doing my thesis study full-time, working at Batelle half-time. So they gave me a half-time fellowship, Batelle did, to do my thesis work. And that's exactly what I did. Working full-time, 40, 50, 60 hours a week, doing my computer analysis and working at one of the projects I had at Batelle, half-time. So Batelle paid for my doctorate. Probably could have gotten by without it, doing the work that I did. I don't think it added a lot to my store of knowledge, other than my thesis work, which turned out to be kind of cute. At the same time, well, after I got my degree, my doctorate, I decided my thesis advisor said, you've got to start calling yourself to be a mechanical engineer. I wasn't sure about that, but I decided to get involved with the ASME, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, and actually I wrote my first paper and presented it in 1963 at a conference in San Francisco. When I began to get involved we'd have conferences several times a year, and I'd be going to these conferences and began to get involved in ASME.
Didn't you start to get involved in politics locally as well? Like you would lobby on behalf of considering engineering?
As I worked up through, finally I ended up being a chair of a couple of different divisions. One, the boiler pressure and piping division, and the computer division at ASME. And they also asked me to, if I wouldn't agree to be a lobbyist for ASME at the state of Ohio. And that was during the 90s, actually after I'd retired. And I was getting like a big stipend at $2,000 a year, I think, to be this lobbyist. My job was to look at, as a lobbyist, to look at at bills that were being considered at at the state of Ohio, and see, particularly if they had elements in the bill that had an effect on mechanical engineering, which is what I did. And the two major bills that I worked on and had some influence on. One was the time the federal government had decreed that the states form coalitions, like several states getting together, and they would pay for building storage facilities for low-level nuclear waste. And this is like gloves that had some amount of radiation on them, and most of the radiation was very low level. And I got a guy from Idaho who had this kit that he used to demonstrate this stuff, and he had a Geiger counter that it set off by one of these little things, and they put a piece of paper between the Geiger counter and the source, and it would stop the radiation. It was that low level. Anyway, so I worked with the committee. Well, the highest state part of the committee included one of the senators from Cleveland, and who became a good friend. And we actually got the bill passed that we would build this thing. The week after the Ohio State Legislature passed this bill, the consortium decided it was cost too much money, and they quit. I mean, they literally quit, told the federal government to go whatever. I can use Rome terms. Anyway, and literally they dumped the whole thing after we had gone through all the trouble of getting this bill passed that we were going to build on. I saw the secretary of that committee some years later, and I said, "Did she think I had helped them?" He says, "You were the reason we got the bill." So I had done something, even though it finally ended up being cut off. The second bill I was involved in was what's called the tort reform, which is that we take a look at the bills that have some influence on design. Our tort reform being that if people who are injured can sue for the injuries. And the idea, as far as engineering is concerned, and this included automobiles manufacturers and all that, you can ask for a statute of limitations, which means after you've built something and it's been used for 15 years, surely the designer has no responsibility, has done with his responsibility. For engineers, if they had involved in the design of something, there was no limitation. You could come back 50 years from something and sue the original designer, which is why we were interested. And and then I was involved in this pretty high class committee. It was called hospitals, car manufacturers, several different manufacturers, and we did, in fact, get a tort reform bill passed. And the sponsor, the representative sponsor of this bill was Pat Teaberry, who was our legislator. And so we became friends. I mean, more than just acquaintances. he eventually went on, and he's been a U.S. rep now and just retired. So,
We have about 15 minutes left, so
one more comment on this
okay,
one.
I'm so sorry.
We got
that's
the-
a hard cutoff.
We got the bill passed. Of course, it had everything in the kitchen sink in it. I mean, for manufacturers, for car builders, hospitals, and so on. And the Supreme Court threw it out because it was because they're only supposed to have one subject in the bill. Just about that time, ASME decided that couldn't afford me anymore, so that was the last thing I did. And it turned out that this committee that I'd been a part of continued to work and have passed some single subject tort reform bills. But those were two that I'd worked on and actually had some help. I had contributed some help in getting passed, and that was essentially the subject or my sub and substance of my lobbyist in ASME.
That's awesome.
I did within ASME. I worked my way up through a couple of these division chairs and whatnot to a committee. I was chaired a committee on policy and whatnot, reporting to the Board of Governors, which get done up to pretty good. And actually, most of that work I had done after I resigned from Batelle, and they agreed to support me, literally support me in my travel, for my travel because I was bringing Batelle's name to the national audience.
That's beautiful.
And after that, I was done with Batelle, and that's November 1989, when I was 65 years old. I had retired, and now I don't know anybody there.
So, speaking of retirement, last question for me before we open it up. We might need to do a part 2 of this sometime, because I know there are a lot of stories here, but you traveled a lot with Grandma and then Doug and Heidi and Greg. We don't have time right now to really dive into that, but I just want to ask you, what did that travel around the world mean to you, and do you have any one story in your mind?
Well, the reason for the travel was I had written papers for and presented them at different ASME international conferences. I've also chaired several conferences. So Batelle paid my way, and if your grandma was interested in going to where we were going, she would go along, and of course we'd pay her way. But then we'd go to conference, and then it'd take 2 or 3 weeks later to do the travel. One of the interesting places. Well, the first time I ever went overseas, we went to a conference in Bristol, which was sort of the west end of England, and we had been at a conference at Batelle just prior to that, and the chair of the Norwegian Society and Scientific Society was there, and it turned out we were on the same plane going to England. So he asked if he couldn't ride. We said, of course he can ride with us. And so he sat in the back seat of our car as we drove across England, and he gave us he had been studied all the local stuff. So he was a travel director for us on that trip. Went to the Salisbury Cathedral. We went to the what's the big stones?
Stonehenge?
Stonehenge. Went to Stonehenge, and he described the history of Stonehenge and all that sort of thing. It was amazing, and he was like, well, that was the 1970s, so, and he was like in his 80s then. So I mean, he's our grandfatherly travel director. It was neat. So we went into Bristol. At Bristol, because I was an American, the director had us, my wife and I, to their dinner. I mean, treated us pretty royally. Went from there on the same trip to France, and spent a couple of days there, 3 days, and then on to, I guess we went on to Geneva for a trip through Europe, for which time I didn't have any. I mean, we just did it on our own. It was a neat travel. The other one that stands out was we had I gave a talk at a international conference at Berlin, and we flew into there on the history or the anniversary of the Berlin airlift, and so there the pilot actually did a sort of swooped around, did a pass around, low-level pass around the airfield at Berlin in sort of the recognizing the Berlin airlift. We landed at a conference, and again with those things, they invited your grandma and I to a dinner at the thing. And we had reps from England, Italy, and Germany. The director of that conference, the chair of that conference, looked like and sounded like Colonel Klink from what was the program? The TV.
I'm gonna Google it after this. I'm not sure.
Well, it's the TV show where the guy was a prisoner and pulled all sorts of shenanigans, and the director of that prison was this Colonel Klink. Anyway, then at that same time, the Italian guys told this joke. I mean, you think of how you might play like an Italian with all the gestures and their mangled English. He told this story. He says, you know, the Italian aircraft designers, they go by the toilet paper rule for design aircraft. He says, you know, the toilet paper never tears where the cyration or the holes. He says every time one of our wings break off, we go through and drill holes in the wing so it doesn't fall off. He tells it with this Italian accent. I mean, he just roared, and I remember the dumb stories forever. Anyway, after that conference, Berlin, we flew down to Stuttgart and rented a car and drove down through the Black Forest, literally the Black Forest, and then of course southern Germany to Munich, where they had the Oktoberfest. So we added that vacation onto our Batelle plan for me to get to Berlin. One of the nicest vacations we ever had, and it was great. Going through the Black Forest, we stopped at this roadside place where they had cuckoo clocks. And it's my recollection that there was one of these cuckoo clocks that had all the carvings on it and the rotating people coming out for $40.
Wow.
That'd be
And
thousands now.
we could not figure any way of getting that back to the States. Now, you think of our place. There's no place in that house on the East Shore Court that you could put a cuckoo clock.
Still would have been cool though.
But
Wait, you had one,
we sort of regret it ever since. Why didn't we build that clock and we could have had a ship back?
Just while we're running out of time, I want to make sure we get to a few important questions.
Sure.
I know we had. Just like 1 minute answers. What is your advice to us as we kind of go through our 20s and 30s?
I don't know. One advice I would give anybody: never, if you find that what you started out to do wasn't what you wanted to do, don't change to do what you want to do. I mean, I said I had 3 different degrees in 3 different subjects at 4 different schools. I told her why I became a chemist, because I happened to do well in the chemistry test. But it wasn't really my field. And it took me two schools to find that out, and I did change. So, yeah, I would say don't be open to all the opportunities you have. I guess I would also say, I'll tell you this, I grew up in the church. My granddad, my father's father, was a Methodist minister, but I was a casual Christian most of my life. And how would I say, even though I lived a reasonably moral existence, after we were married, we attended church regularly. I still must say, from my background of being a loner, until I got to the disciple study and so on. I am dedicated now. I truly do, in my soul, believe in God. I also, at this point in time in my life, I am almost at the best place in my life I've ever been, because now I have the chance to do all these things for God, and I'm doing it, and it's a satisfying existence.
That's beautiful. I guess just to wrap things up, any message you want to give both to our family who are going to be seeing this, and any future grandchildren you might have?
Grandchildren, oh my God. We're not grandchildren.
Yes. Yeah, you guys find spouses. Trust God will give you a spouse and have kids. Now, how would I say? I may have said it, but I'll say it again. In a real sense, I feel like I've skated through life because I think God has watched over me all these years. I don't think I've done what, although I'm a sinner and we all are, I have been somehow prevented from being nasty, or whatever you want to call it. So I think I would consider, ask you all to live a moral life as long as you see it. I think you all are great kids. I am so proud of all that you guys have done and what you guys are now, that I have friends, any number of friends whose children have become addicts, and others. And I now see, as I go into the prisons, the covers weekends, these guys who have done terrible things. We don't ask, but we watch them go through the weekend and become dedicated Christians. To me, nobody is out of redemption. There's always a chance. And you guys know what I believe in.
I think that's the perfect note to end on. Because we just have this one camera shooting. If we could get everyone in here for a group hug, I think that might be the appropriate way to go.
How about
you stay here.
That's where it's go.
Can you see us?
This is just going to look like a mass of bodies.
Oh, okay.
Thanks, Grandpa.
Love you, Grandpa.
I love you. You are neat kids.
Okay.
You're kids, yeah, sure.